personal macro workbook, or the personal workbook, whichever you prefer to call it, does not actually exist until you create your first macro. Then when you've created your first macro, Excel will generate the personal macro workbook and store your macro in there, assuming you chose to store it in the personal macro workbook. Now, the personal macro workbook, once it exists, is opened every time you start Excel so that the macros within there are available to you. So if I were to go to my developer ribbon and click on macros, it will list all the macros that are currently in this file, which is none, plus the ones that are in the personal macro workbook. And we can see two, one called age and one called run form. You can see the name of the personal macro workbook is called personal.xlsb. Now, if I create a new macro, I'll just create a quick and easy one, start, type guy, and we're going to store this in the personal macro workbook. So not in the current file, but in the personal macro workbook. Okay, guy, and we'll make it go super large and auto fit, and then we can stop. Now, if I go to my macro list, I can see we now have personal.xlsb type guy, and that exists, and I can run that at any stage. So if I cancel, start a new sheet, macros, type guy, and it runs and types guy in A1. Now, I actually don't need to save this file because the macro is stored in the personal macro workbook. So if I close this file, save the changes, don't bother saving them. However, if I exit Excel, I will be asked if I want to save the changes to the personal macro workbook. If you click yes, the macros will be available next time you start Microsoft Excel because I've saved them in the file. If I click don't save, then I actually lose the macro that I've just created. So I would always click save if it's a macro I then want to retain in the personal macro workbook. Now, for those of you who are conscious about backing up and keeping backups of important files, the personal.xlsb is an important file. So we need to know where it's stored on your machine. Well, that will differ based on the version of Windows and based on your installation type. But I can give you a guide. It's actually in a folder called XLS Start. The XLS Start folder will always be contained in a folder called Excel, which will always be contained in a folder called Microsoft. Then it may differ in that where we have roaming here, it may be local, but prior to that, it has app data. Prior to that is your user login name. So we currently have training. And then prior to that is users. And then the C drive might differ depending on where your version of Windows is installed. So we're looking at the installation drive for Windows, /users, /your username, /app data, /roaming or local, /Microsoft, /Excel, /XLS Start. And in that XLS Start folder, you will see your personal.xlsb file. It's that file that would need saving, backing up in whatever routine you use to make sure that you keep your important files safe. If you don't back up the personal.xlsb file and your machine crashes or contracts a virus, and you lose the personal.xlsb file, then you lose all your macros. It's just a little caveat. So that's storing them in the personal.xlsb file. The advantage to storing them in there is that they then are available to you on your machine every time you use Excel. If you ever email anybody any Excel files, they don't get your macros. They just get the contents of the file. The macros stay on your machine for you to run. So the files that you save don't need to be macro enabled. They can be normal XLSX files because all the code is stored on your machine in your personal.xlsb. So hopefully that helps to explain the personnel file. It doesn't get created until you create your first macro and choose to store it in the personal macro workbook. And then any macros you store in there are available every time you start Excel because that file is started every time you start Excel, but it's hidden. So you start Excel and you get presented with book 1, but behind the scenes is hidden away the personal macro workbook, open and ready for you to use the macros from within it.